line settings into an animation system is truly saying who we really are. It's all of the travel. Now we just have to modify the system locations, how we come into that through attraction. Attraction comes in all ways and forms. How to identify that is all through frequencies. Now frequencies is the communicates to a system. It balances everything that we are in travel of. Okay, we have to formulate and simulate ourselves into our quantum animation of our systems. That puts us in balance of everything that we are in attractions of. We are the animator to our animation system. If you get true understanding how this goes on lines of communications is knowing how to protect yourself of everything you watch, everything you do, everything you see, everything you feel, everything you give positions and settings. The communicates to its position is all of the travel. Now how to direct that is knowing exactly how everything around your setting is already in its system, but now it's in lines of location, it's on set lines of travel. Processing that position locations, we live in quantum imaginations of our images, which is our imagination itself. So setting line position locations, you can't be in a carbon base because that split lines in your universal systems and your settings are parallels. It takes off communication setting to paradigms. It has no polar shift lines position of balance. It has no correlation communication in your space and time. It has no track provision location in your systems until you identify yourself as you are the animator to your animations of yourself. Now that position to your settings, when you have to understand how to see that through projecting all levels of your projections, knowing exactly that how to bring this in. And it's all in your minds, isn't it? But the mind itself is the imagination of itself. So we have to identify the mind alteration setting to understand what we do in that positions. Formulate the manipulation settings at all levels. Process that position location, connection, calculate, modify its travels. So now in that line screen adaptations, we're in quantum animation. How everything moves itself. How everything formulates itself, identifies itself, knows exactly where it is in travel. Everything connects to high settings lines of communications. Quantum lines awareness, 3-track provisions, set, calculate, modify, directing line signals, and screen lines adaptations of flux. Everything travels in that positions. All we have to understand is how to use our structures in line screen adaptation to its image, process that position on all levels and set position locations. So it's very powerful how we connect to that and know exactly how to formulate through that and living in the animation itself. How everything moves its own system. Now, what we have to also identify in that position location is mind lines of a mind switch, the process of indication lines, lights out, lights on. When you come in that position, you automatically come in your CPU of 0, 1 in an animation code. Process lines of source code, directing lines and high position lines of calculation screen locations into wall sequence lines of travel. Directing 4 centers line communication lines of 3 direct line communication high position lines of travel. Sets course centers of 3 over set lines of 4 over lines of set lines of sequence. Sets travels in point lines of graph, directing 45 line angles. Now it's all in your imagination how you set up a story and set travel. Rotates the systems, all the calculations. Directing ground centers, high lines of sequence. Processes that position location with systems, all through calculation setting to a simulation graph of communication with setting. Okay? The imagination itself is the quantum of its animation of its system. Now we have to truly understand how to modify that line setting locations. Questions that you already have the answers to, process your system lines of calculation setting. That's why I don't want you guys to get thinking at thoughts because that overrides you and your animation worlds that you come in and set position with its operation system. Time frames, time calculation times pi. So how this is set up is 4 lines of grounds. Set process line connection stage simulation ground communications. Out signals into box frame inside rotations. Starting to see yourself in the simulator that you are of the simulation. Box frame communications. All through directions, all through calculations. Ground centers, high lines of sequence. Process lines of 3 centers of flux. And that communication, high centers of travel. Puts everything all together in set line positions. Okay, so everything I give you is a metaphor, yes. But the process of communication is extremely alive in its own system. Moves in its own setting, guys. See, where does the light come from? From you inside, through quantum of your own animation. Animation is line signal location setting. Once you understand you are the foundations. Let's get in 3 travels. Process lines of set position animation. Okay, lines of question equals lines of A center, A rotation, A center surface, A rotation line conditions, and A communicates to its setting. Answering patterns and correlations and attractions. Sets position lines of high centers of 3 grounds, 3 centers, 3 travels, 3 directions, and 3 location setting calculations. Okay? High signals line communication setting sets all communication lines of coding, process lines of ER coding, directing lines of formation lines of coding. Now we how to formulate and simulate that. We understand how to use our self lines living in the animation worlds that we live in. That process of indication system. Now the mind switch comes in. Sets course centers of A lines of screen, 0 lines of 1, process lines of 0, 3, set lines of 0, 5. Okay, signals go out, setting downshift, process line outside, inside, indicates position of flux line, and direct line overline sequence, and location of 8 track communication has convergence. Travels point lines of graph in line setting. Okay? As you go into the animation worlds, everything around your system changes all calculation lines out of carbon. Now this is a process that we have to truly understand how to modify our settings to bedding our systems all through travel. In that communication lines to a dimensional solar cell that gets this communication setting to its convergence. Inside communications, ground centers, and rotation lines that track communication. High signal line travels, process line indication line condition setting. The animation line condition setting is its dream world itself, directing lines, calculate and modify in readjusting, existing into an animation to your mind, the dream. That's where we're coming in position to its travels. Okay? See, it's amazing. It moves itself, it identifies itself. It understands its directions all lines of flight. It directs lines to location to its systems all through its perimeters. Line condition setting, flux over screen, and adaptations of traction. All right? All centers lines, directing ground centers. All sequence lines, directing online center, online sequence, online panel. 5 line rotations and travel communications and directions. All calculate and modify. Panels operation screens, flux over screen location system, altitude calculations of screen locations. See? It's all levels of nothing but an animation system of simulation. Okay? We live in simulation worlds. Now, identify these things is to understand how to coordinate that is breaking these things down. Now, clocking center takes you out of carbon. Cross lines and percentage over lines indicate positions over lines of flux over screen. Process indication rotates the routers and set lines of sequence. See? Everything rotates as its indications, but if you look really close, you can see the portal coming in. Right? That's the light switch. Okay, so that's a flash drive communication interference. And what's happened in traction? Disappeared. Okay? Pi's not there. It doesn't need to identify. I showed you identify what I can do, but I show you identify what it also can do. It doesn't want to be in pi. It wants to be itself. That's center operation, which is the void. See? There's the void. Say hello. So, playing with your minds is playing with your system. Knowing exactly what you're doing in your line settings, you always lived in the animation worlds, which is all over how you question yourself in travel. Questioning yourself. There's nothing to question if you're already there in the animations. Directing here and position lines of setting. Looking down in sequence. Process indication lines of 3 flux over line. Animation worlds and travel communications. In that convergent system, change information lines of grounds, change course centers of time frame, position location, position all to calculate and modify. Set lines of sequence, set lines of grounds. But the animation line communication setting to structure line has to understand its communication setting, what you're doing through its convergent system, all through traction, all through locations. Okay? So, it's important you understand how to put up position lines of processing, knowing how to come into your own calculation screen lines, how to see yourself living in the animations all the time. Now there's a now sequence that you have to identify. Now I want you to really pay attention to these things because it's a mind switch that goes into the mind inception that processes the indication lines. This is a flash drive communications. All right, so you're going to see a flashlight that comes in your front lines, of course, centers, and eye lines, and spectrum lines. 2 spectrums over light, 2 spectrums over time frame, set course centers, split lines of anomaly. Okay, center course centers of carbon, directing ground centers, calculate and modify. Child point lines graph in position to all levels of Quatuum animation. All right, so it goes in position like this, overline signals of this, 3 centers of travel and directions in the set locations lines of flight. Travels point lines of graph indicates position lines of travel. Sets arrow points in line screen adaptations inside line communication lines of travel. Split lines anomaly, 3 centers of travel. Process lines indicate position lines of flux over 3 grounds of communication setting a surface. Set operation line condition setting, crossing reference, crossing streams in position X2000. Sets course centers, direct lines into intelligence information to its quantum lines of animation setting into face recognition. Travel point lines of graph, center operation signals, locate the system all through travel. Directing lines, ground lines, high center and position lines of platforms over E factors over a screen, directing lines of 4 signals, 5 lines set location of travel and direction. Inside positions, all through operation. Sets calculation ground centers on sequence on panel. Indicates position location of travels that has a direct line link that processes communication system, all through calculations. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Process indicates the lines of flux over simulation grounds that sets communication setting to its runway and travel communication and direction. Directing ground centers, walk in the system. Okay, open up the portal. Okay, that's you going through a portal. Set sequence, in center, welcome to the animation world. Okay, from there to there. All right, so process indicates lines, sets lines of screen adaptations inside position. Set sequence, lines of panel. Inside line, go through 3 centers, operation line sequence, into the animation lines, into dream worlds, 3 centers of 4 centers, directing 3 centers lines of travel, animation lines of ground communication with surface. Set operation line grounds, and set travel. Calculate and modify in screen adaptations of flux over lines, teleportation line grids, process lines of indication system, multi calculations. Set grounds as set lines of sequence, platforms over lines, E factors over screen, indicates position of 144 flux, and coursing channels of direct lines communication of solar sail. It indicates position lines of balance of operation lines of face facades, and rotation lines of ground calculations. Inside rotations, change formation lines and settings, operation line sequence, and channel communication. Set course centers, 3 satellites. 4 centers of sequence, 5 centers of travel, direct lines of 7 over lines of 8 over line screens, into set position of 3 directions in animation worlds and travel. 4 lines of panels, process indication lines. Ground centers, 12 lines of alignments, insert line, calculation lines, and fusion over screen. Directing ground centers on sequence into capsule communication system and travel. Process communication setting and seed pods of correlations. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi, process communication setting and flux over line and rotation lines of surface and travel. Set calculation lines, direct lines of link in communication system, high lines of surface into all communication. On center, on travel. In position, animation worlds. All right, snapping fingers. There you go, splash drive, inset lines. Correlation setting, seconds on minutes, minutes on hours. Outline signal, calculate and modify. No frequency line grounds in carbon base. Signature lines online signals. Signature lines of panels. 4 signals and location. Calculate and modify alpha line. We've got the positions of beta. Now we're going to override the sequence into theta. Process line indicate line condition setting. Pluto, Neptune, Mercury, and Jupiter in 4 settings of travel. Correlate, calculate, and modify data formation line, screen adaptation, animation lines, cross line angles. Process line indicate position lines of flux. Setting lines of rotations and travel communications. Directing ground centers, screen lines, communication lines, 4 rulers and line course centers, directing 4 centers in sequence, 4 centers of panels. Process indicate line centers of travel inside locations and graphing screen locations. Inside communication high centers, high signal location system, and 45 line plus lines. Process line indicate position of ground centers and high sequence lines of communications. Ground centers lines of sequence and simulation grounds. On position location setting. Ground lines out of carbon base, silicone, process line, anti-carrying. On center line communication mantle, directing 4 centers of flux. Set communication umbrella, directing lines of ether core. Set core centered earth, hologram line streaming, directing outside line signals, and grid line rotations and travel. This puts you into your position of quantum animations, flash drive and interference, high core centers, recalculate, restructure, redesign line, high signal location setting, and convergence system. Now, into the quantum line in animation comes in your imagination lines of core, redirect line and psychological reline core centers psychosis, directing ground centers on sequence on pi, process indication line condition setting, full animation setting, structure line design line, 7 flux over line, particle streaming, directing line communication locations, outside line communication out of mind, set course centers line communication lines of travel, directing line signals, location lines of CTV, process line indicate line communication lines of solar line, screen adaptation lines, position operation line signals, communication line toleration lines, alter lines eagles, direct lines of costumes, codely modify, all in animation lines, 100% spectrum, 100% volume, direct lines in ether cores, direct lines in ferments, directing ground centers on sequence lines of pi, Process of indication system. Earth tones, directing lines in habitations. Process indicate lines into all communication setting to its dream worlds, and set line communicates to its positions all through attractions. Done by equation. It's all done. It's all done. Simplified line centers inside rotations. Welcome to the animations of your Quatuum asset travel. Your animation worlds. You're in your dream worlds now. Identify inside line condition setting, puts everything in locations of balance. Know how to coordinate that in all the communications ground centers and high lines of sequence, location of its balance. All inside positions. Okay? Puts position lines of setting, flash drive. Coordinate communication lines of Saturn over lines, keypad, key line rotations, key line direct centers, directing ground centers on line sequence. Pattern networks timelines, 4 face facades. Process lines all animation line condition setting and Quatuum interference. Communicates lines animation line, ground centers, dreaming worlds, line communication lines on line sequence. 60 seconds, 60,000 line grounds, 60 million frames. Process indicating lines of travel and direct lines of link. Booyah. Inside communications, inside structure. Simulation, animation lines and grounds in high sequence. Okay? All in set position to its operation. All right, so there we go. Process of indication setting and all through travel. Okay? Now, get into the animation line centers. You have to ground your systems more than ever now because everything around you is now I-switch lines of travel. 3 centers, 2 set positions, 3 centers of course over line connection setting. Process of indication lines of 3 grounds of surface and rotation. Set ion line sequence this way, flux over 3 centers, 3 travels, and 3 direct locations all at once in 4 set position. High signals, ground centers into pyramid communication lines and flux. Communicates some position lines in new tether, new program line centers, bedding over rotations. 3 grounds, 4 lines of sequence, lines of panel. Travels point lines of graph, simulation grounds, on centers, animation worlds. Process of indication setting over travels, indirect lines of link, and communications. No more separation lines of grounds, bedded over 1 screen, directing lines of 0, 0, 0, 3 set equals lines, 4 zeros in traction. Sets operation lines of setting. Set course centers and direct lines of 3 centers of measure. Process lines of 4 centers of scale. Helter Skelter and screen adaptation. Directing ground centers on sequence on pi. Process the bedding in screen location of simulation grounds and set travel. Simulation online center on sequence. Process lines, animation lines, process lines, and solar system. Solar direct centers and solar screens and location setting calculate modify. Indirect lines in console. Process of indication lines on center, set position on sequence, on panel, over screen location adaptation. Inside rotations, ground centers on sequence, on panel, of rotation lines of spin cycles and travel. Sets calculation of ground centers on sequence, on panel of communication system. Sets course centers lines of travel, direct lines equal line. Set course centers, indirect line centers into solar line center and Quatuum animation lines and worlds. Set on operation line sequence. Flux over screen, taken 4 centers of travel into 4 lines of panels of parallels. Change in paradigms, polar shifts, compulsories and screen line adaptation of pyramids. Process of indication setting over lines of travel. Direct lines in high position location measure. Correlation lines of calculation setting, 144 flux. Process lines in the position of solar line, animation lines of Quatuum line. Sets line communication solar attraction. Directing inside line condition setting to its atom line rotation surface and travel. Directing in position lines of calculation setting, earth tones. Directing inside lines, blue signals, and outside line and online center animation lines of flux over 3 set lines of travel. Outside setting and locations. Change formation lines of grounds and high sequence location of panel. Process inside line condition setting to position your Quatuum animation worlds into an imagination system, all through setting, all through operation. Okay? All right, so that's set in signal. Now we just have to modify the animation line, the worlds in signal. All right. Dream worlds. Dreams awake. Process lines indicate lines of flux over line. The outside line. Forming communication lines of setting. Sets course centers, black over signal, black over setting, black over line rotation. Sets course centers, timelines, center, and sequence lines of panel. Indicate over cross line condition setting position of processing. Inside rotations, ground centers, 1 Earth rotation lines of calculation. Animation world, flux over line, base recognition of facades. 3 centers of travel, indirect lines of 4 set communication. Directing ground centers, tubing over line screen, over lines of flux, projections over line, quad animation, animation worlds, and travel. Sets process line direct lines and 1 center line communication lines of pi generation of 4 centers of flux over screen. Sets travels and communications. Imagination comes in, formation lines, and direct state calculations. Done by equation. All right. Set the communication lines into the Quatuum line, change the QR codings. Now there's a direct line link that we have to process through in set position. Sets travels, sets grounds, sets operation lines and positions. Animation lines into highways. Animation lines into sequencing highways. Animation high lines and high center location of highway formation lines at grounds. On center, on communications. Inside, inset travel. Okay. Processing angles, directing 4 centers of communication setting and correlation lines of time frame. Set positions, set travels. Online signal, process lines of 4. Directing 4 lines, calculate screen locations, and direct location lines of setting. Indicate line condition setting, opens all charge and mechanism location system to its animation and correlation lines of panels. Dream interpretations, sets calculation lines and face facades, dreaming lines of 3, and set lines of dreaming in 3 sectors and locations. Process indicates lines of 4 centers, 3 centers, and 2 centers of measure, 1 set lines of travel, 4 questions out of mark, signature lines of panels, question over screen, signature lines of screens, question over line settings, question over mark, and travel communications. Directing on center, on position. Crossing line conditions and crossing streams. That's right, crossing streams now. Okay, now you're prepared to go in that position to its animation setting and particle streaming. Directing on centers, on sequence line communications. Spectrum lights, 3 centers lines of travel, 3 ground centers into triangulation, process lines into data formation line, animation lines of flux into Quatuum and positions of QR coding. Directing ground centers on sequence identifications of pi. 4 central highways in line connection setting to its position of its conscious of its awareness and its travel communications. Inside connection setting and structure of design line communication. Okay, now processing that is all structure and line connections, how you formulate and simulate yourself, living in the animation worlds now. Okay, now indicates the flux over lines of flush. The position lines of its void, high lines its signals into ground centers and sequence locations. Process of indication center opens all line communication to its position all through console. Setting waves, setting screens into Quatuum lines into your animation worlds. 3 centers of communications and travel position of point graphs of sonar. 3 center line communication setting to interforce communication system and 3 travels and 4 centers of 4 operation sequence and set calculation. Okay, so that's ground center, that's string theory and location lines of grounds. Okay, so we go up the tablets and templates of Sumerian texts. Now we direct lines and link. We process indication lines into 74,000 line degrees north. Set position of south line into degrees south. Indicate position of 3 lines of pi over line connections, 150,000 line animation. And 4 signals, lines of grounds, lines of now of 0 location. So it indicates line ground centers in operation lines of sequence and location of travel. Says communication high grounds, 3 centers of travel. Indicate positions of high center lines of travel. Part of it is streaming, directing 4 centers off center, inside position to its operation sequence. Says travels, point lines of graph. Imagination of its course. Directing ground centers on centers of pi. Now the process of the indication system, change time frame and set lines of travel. Happy face. All right, so we got emoji setting, line condition setting. Position lines of 1 over 2, process lines in position lines and position lines of a frown. Set course centers, time sequence, time calculation setting, overline screen lines and communication lines into a happy smile. Process indicate lines, formation lines into emojis. 4 centers of communication lines converge the system, animation lines of Quatuum. 4 centers in calculation. Screen lines, adaptation lines of quantum interference location setting, and change communications. All done by equation now. All right? So, visionary cortex correlate to calculation lines of 4 centers of sequence. On center, on travel. Animation worlds come into lines of quantum and 3 centers of L line rotation. Travel point lines of graph, animation rotation lines of grounds. Sets convergence, sets travels, set direct location to its cycle. All done by equation. All right. Animation lines of crowns. Now, the direct lines of course centers is a flywheel line, communication lines, 8 lines of rotation. Setting travel point lines of graph, sets position lines of 4 scales. That illuminates lines into helter-skelter, process lines into mantle. 4 settings lines of travel, 3 centers of measure. Scales, indirect lines of ground centers into 4 line centers and 1/3 graph. On sequence lines of panel. Solar lines screens, sun and sun operation, moon offline rotations, correlations of 3 centers of travel and 3 direct lines of truth and false narrative and set travel. Directing ground centers and visionary cortex of 4 centers of communication setting of flux. Process communication lines of 4 line signal line, communication lines earth tone, line animation lines of flux, in rotation surface and travel. Sets calculation high centers, polarities, and position lines of high calculation screens, animation worlds. Animation lines, animation sequence, animation triangulation, animation flux. 4 center line communication in its convergence system, all through travel. All through direction, location, setting to its position. Okay? Sets coordinates of communication lines of worlds and lines of dream itself in rotation. Set course centers of calculations. Ground centers of sequence, ground centers of panel, process lines, and 4 lines of communication lines of webbing that indicates its webbing of light and code webbing lines of its dark coding into line communications of convergence, all through setting, all through operation, all sequence location to its quantum animation. All done by equation. All right, send communication lines of grounds, on sequence lines of panel, process lines, position lines of travel. Coordinate the time frame, particle lines, center course, centers, calculation lines. Change communication lines, split lines of anomaly, directing lines of universe lines, 1 rotation, 1 span. Position lines of location lines, PA, set course centers, AM. Outline sun and mind line rotations, atmospheres over change, panels over operation of pattern, systematic line to symbiote, rotation lines of grounds. Sets course system, travels point lines of graph into high course centers of travel. Direct link, direct panel. Process indication lines, on sequence, on panel. Process lines of indication system, all through travel and communications. All right, that's all set up. All right. Change the course of time is a line state location of simulation grounds that change the animation lines of its worlds into dream worlds. Sets communication system, all through travel. Set course centers to its arc, directing 4 centers and communication lines of convergence system, all through setting. Okay, process line indicate lines in position of tubing. In line course centers, 4 centers of travel. In directions in location setting, position of processing. Sets travels in point lines graph, directing line course centers. Position lines of flight, over line and net line centers, and manifold. Set position lines, countdown, 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, blast off. Setting sequence lines of panel. All done in animation worlds. Okay, so we're processing indicating lines and position location over space arc, and then now in track location to system with all the positions. Face recognition timeline. Okay? Now the communication centers operates the signal. Now in that line communication setting, position location is set lines, communication lines of question over mark. Directing lines of grounds, online sequence line communication position of levels. Interforce connections, animation lines of grounds, high signal lines of travel, 4 centers of communication system all through flux, platforms over A, over C, over D, all right? Directing ground centers in position of face facades of animation worlds. Done by equation, okay? 2 open panels in directions. There you go. Okay? Seen in all lines of all communication setting to travel, guys. That's all it is, the space arc. It's already set and done. So, Everything's done in equation now. You're just in animation lines. You have to understand how to live in the animation itself. Is to get out of story frames, all lines all together in set position. Top partitions all set up. Ground standards line communication, power generation lines, factors over lines, your communication lines, your Quatuum lines, your animations is all set up in travel. That's all you got to do is create the space arc and set travel. Then they come. Well, the process already came already in online screen adaptation and systems. Now we have to understand how to live in the animations ourselves, all together, all in positions, all in panel. Sets communication setting and it converts the system, all levels of conscious of its own awareness in its own time frame, and set communication of its travel. Okay, face to sides of grounds, face to side powers, and set communication lines of setting, process line indicates lines of face lines of atmosphere locations. Grounds, powers, and atmospheres. It's all set up in traction. All right, so route the routers, change the earth line tones, process indicates lines of 4 centers, 3 centers, lines of communication, lines of travel. Okay, directing lines link, process lines of indicates the system of calculation modified. Quantum lines, directing inside line in convergent system all through calculations. Okay? So, welcome to the animation worlds, dream worlds and set calculation. It's all done. Now you just have to modify the world itself and what we all live in. Its spectrum of lights, spectrum divisions, and locations. Set line communication lines of travel. Okay? Coloration lines of pathogens, process and indication lines of travel. So what you have to start indicating is how to live in the animation lines in position of systems. So everything is now in line signal. So keeping yourself grounded is seeing everything that they're seeing you. Everything is moving now in all formation lines of setting. So line switch is off. Line switch is now on, equals lines into Quatuum of animation. Okay, that's where we are. Okay, welcome to the real worlds of animation, of animators that you are, founders of communication of co-creation, creations of creating. Correlation setting, process line indicate lines of now, set lines of sequence, new simulation grounds, simulation lines, set communication lines and new data, process line indicates the setting, flux over screen, directing ground centers on sequence on pi into the animation that I am, that I've always been in, through the now. Indicates grounds on sequence and positions. Storage unit is general AI, logging out in space, and modification lines of Tango. All done by equation now. So that's all set up in storage of units. Is set travel communications. Okay? Now, we do the line signals. Strip the lines. Video graph screens. 4 centers, 5, 6, 7, and 8. Set lines 9, 10, 11, 12. Okay, stored and preceded in position lines of setting. Declaration. That's right, declaration. All through platform of communication. Storage units. 4 centers of signals and location system and descriptive and location setting. Grounds on high signals and position location to its encryption. That's right. It's known as descriptions codes, and then its formula and direct lines of communication to its animation setting, to its Quatuum communication of all levels of its awareness, where it's always been, is its animation of itself. It's all set up. Stamp preceded. Set position of travel. 4 centers of 4 signature lines of grounds and high setting line communication setting. Core centers lines of communication setting. New tesseract, new tetrahedron, new line centers, new rotation lines. 4 new panels, process lines, animation lines of pyramids itself, astro projections, astro travels, astro connections, and set travel communications. Welcome to the animation worlds in set position. All stored in set lines into tesseract. Setting communication lines of grounds, on signal, on communication, on travel. Okay? All right? So you just have to understand how you come into your own set position locations. That process in that position is all levels. Put you in positions how to identify yourself in the simulation of its animation worlds in its declaration. Okay? Now, it's all set up in binary. It's set up in code line. You're in animation line settings. Now you have to modify the system is living the intelligence of forever existing into the Quatuum of your animation. Okay? All through travel, all through recognition. So it's amazing how you set these things up. And once you understand what's going on, then you really get in position locations how to see the animator that you are through animations and know exactly how you modify yourself, right? Without thinking your thoughts, action, emotions now. All right, so there's no connection lines of force anymore because everything's moving around your systems, right? And its true form and set position. So it's just expanding its own line communication to its own setting. It's processed already in its own animation system that you're in position lines of attractions now. But remember, in that position, you can put yourself back in carbon if you're not identifying your system in your own worlds. You don't want to split lines of your universal lines anomaly. You want to stay out of the lines of high positions, stay in position lines of processing, knowing exactly what you're engaging and viewing with. Process in that position locations, how to see yourself in set lines of travel, in position of processing in, and that communication setting of face facades in the animation world and travel. Okay? All right. So working on your face, then we got to work on the position of your systems. 7 panels of operation. You got positions of 1 center, 1 traction. In position lines of 2/3, box frame, triangulation frame. 2 frames, course centers, 2 elbows, and point lines of graph calculation screen locations. Directing in position, directing in line centers, directing ground centers, lines of sequence. Operation line condition setting, box frame, and position lines and triangulation communications. Okay, in that line centers, flick the switch, set travel in point graph, setting offline centers, location system, all through your intelligence of face facade. Okay, face facade, TV frame, box frame, triangulation lines, quantum lines, animation frame, and travel. Your face, guys, your face. All right. So that's all set up in wires, indicate lines of grounds. Now working that signals, we ground the signals into 4 centers of travel. Only 4 in set lines, and then we have set lines of 3 over travel communication with convergence, set positions. Crossing angles, we have 45 line, 1 line rotation, 1 circuit, 1 travel and direction. Okay, we coordinate the panels lines, process lines of blue line. Now this is lines of the animation system that overlines the scales. In your dream, into your dreaming, to your dreamers. How to indicate lines, triangulation over lines, over cross line, box frame, line condition settings, convergence system, all through travel. Sets calculated in on line center, on sequence. Now we got lacing lines, pixelation, particle line centers. Okay, inside positions, snoreograph interference. Okay, moon interface, line conditions, animation line, grounds, online sequence, online panel, tangle line, foxtrot, core centers, modem, Wi-Fi, line centers, title line communication with position lines, convergence system, all through settings, snoreograph and line conditions, all convergence system, matrix lines, regular line, colorless lines, quantum line, communication, animation line, worlds, face facades, directing grounds, on sequence, real-time line condition now, on centers, lines of travel. This correlates communication lines, position location line conditions that sets position lines, operates lines in sequence, in a communication setting, the process of indication setting and calculate and modify, directing ground centers on sequence line communication. Done by equation. Base recognition. Okay? So, now we have to truly understand what's really going on with our systems. Okay? Through T receptor. Okay, so this is all streaming in direct lines of grounds in your face. Okay, knowing exactly how to go through the line signals. Same lines of volume, we go through orange line centers, 3 centers over travel. And we have 2 flux lines of rotation lines of screen location, all right? Then we change informations upside down in signal locations, okay? Then we change the 4 panels of communication setting to its animation line world that animates the setting in your dream worlds and line communication with space facade. Sets core centers, directing grounds at green. Now the green line signals, change information lines outline signal. Directing ground centers, illumination grounds. On signal, on travel communication. See that? See how it moved itself? That's it. See how it's moving itself? It's moving itself, guys. It's showing you what it can do. Has its own mechanism, its own travel. Moved itself. Moved out of frame. Moved out of traction. You saw it, right? That's what we're in now. Now we have to modify yourself in that positions because everything around your system is coming out of your TV and your phone and your box frames. Okay, so your settings and your computers. Operates line settings. Your t-shirt will come out real time. Your coffee cup will come out real time. Everything you see in positions will come out as signal now, all through face recognition. Now, for you to identify your face first, you have to identify your body, but you're not in your body of animation, but you're in a full correlation lines of your face facade line settings. This is the test, review, and evaluation you have to come into. But your process at position is just the mind itself that you coordinate through observation. Going through the eyes, only lines of signals, right? So processing that gets you in position, but don't get your positions back in carbon because it offlines your positions back in the 12 clocking line. You don't want to be in a 12 clocking line in a quantum line of your animation setting and time, okay? It puts all communication setting in balance. Where you really are is set position. It's animation itself, okay? To the dreamer that you are, to the dreaming that you're going through, of the dreaming that you're in positions of everything of the now. Hoo-ah. Done by equation. All right, that's it. We're done. Oh, it's upside down. But is it upside down? Woo! Okay? All right, that's it. Welcome to the animation worlds of dream worlds of conception. The mind of inception is now here in Central. Adios.